Hi, everyone. Welcome to season 4 of the Farm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I was joined by three different guests to discuss the new book called Be Fruitful, The Etrog in Jewish Art, Culture, and History. I was first joined by Professor Joshua Teplitsky, who is the editor, one of the editors of this volume, and we discussed the book generally, as well as his chapter that he wrote in the book, which is chapter 10, The Esroger, Risk, Reward, and Ridicule. I was then joined by Professor Debra Kaplan, who co-authored Chapter 7 with Professor Edward Fram, which is titled The Four Species in Pre-Modern Europe, Views from East and West. And finally, I was joined by Dr. Zev Eleff to discuss his chapter, which is Chapter 14, The Etrog Trade in the New World, which was authored together with Professor Jonathan Sarna. So it's one podcast episode, but it's going to be in a row. So it's first Professor Teplitsky, then Professor Kaplan, then Dr. Ellis. So it was recorded separately and I put them together. So just wanted to get here in the beginning and say that. And as well as always, to welcome everyone to the fourth season of the podcast. And as always, if anyone has any questions, comments, feedback, suggestions, to email me, farmchatter@gmail.com. And if anyone wants to support or to the podcast or to sponsor an episode, to either go on the website, farmchatter.com, or send me an email, farmchatter@gmail.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Farm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Joshua Teplitsky, who is the Joseph Meyerhoff Associate Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Pennsylvania. I should say previously was on the podcast when it was on like the Twitter Live. It's one of the earlier episodes about his book on David Oppenheim in his library, but this is the first time I guess the podcast proper. Regardless, we'll be discussing a new book that he edited, one of the editors. So it's called Be Fruitful, The Etrog in Jewish Art, Culture, and History, edited by Warren Klein, Sharon Lieberman-Mintz, and Joshua Teplitsky. And he also wrote chapter 10 in the book, which we'll discuss a fair bit about, which is called The Esroger, Risk, Reward, and Ridicule. So with that, thank you, Professor Teplitsky, for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me. It's so exciting to be here.
Okay, so this is an interesting project, and we'll talk more about some of the chapters. So how did this project begin to write to edit and collect the chapters, various essays from different authors and different people in the field on Esrog? How did this come to be?
I'm glad you asked the question. This started with an accidental discovery. In the process of doing the research for my first book on David Oppenheim, Chief Rabbi of Prague and book collector, I visited the city of Prague to spend time in the archives there to learn about what the Jewish community of Prague was like, how it related to its wider environments. And as I was looking through different archival material, I kind of stumbled over a small file of manuscript documents about the trade of paradise apples, as they were called in the German language script, paradise apples. And I was curious, what are these things? And so I went to the archivists and ordered up these files and understood simply from reading them as anybody would, that this was about the challenges and the conflicts that revolved around the trade of Esrogim for Jewish communities in the Middle Ages and in early modern Europe, meaning between the years 1500 and 1800, although those were challenges that were from antiquity all the way to well into the 20th century, if not beyond. So it started as just a funny little discovery. And once I started thinking about Esrogim, I couldn't open a single set of tshuvas from the period, or a Sefer Minhagim, or the list goes on, without somewhere an Etrog popping up in one place or another. They're everywhere. And I was convinced that the Etrog is a way into telling big stories about the Jewish people and Jewish history from the vantage point of a very little but important thing.
So from there, this is your chapter in the book, but how did this become a collaboration between you and Warren Klein and Sharon Lieberman-Mintz, the editors, and then to this whole book with all these different people that wrote in? How did that happen?
So it started by me being very excited about this Etrog. And every time I would talk to a fellow scholar or somebody who was interested in the topic, they would say, I didn't think of it before, but I actually have a couple of sources. I have a couple of stories. I have a couple of references for you. And that was the genesis of getting a group of people together who were all interested in this topic, each had a different angle or vantage point or perspective, and we thought if we bring them all together, something really interesting could come here. The match between myself and Sharon Lieberman Mintz was a critical juncture. I was interested in the historical part, but I was introduced to Sharon Lieberman Mintz, who is curator at Sotheby's and at the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. And she has a wonderful range of deep knowledge about Jewish art and visual material culture across time and place. And between her interests in visual culture and mine in the textual elements, it was a match made in heaven. The mix was complete when we partnered with Warren Klein, who was the curator at Temple Emmanuel. And the three of us together began to develop a plan for bringing together scholars who work from ancient times to the present to contribute chapters to this collective volume.
So you're saying, like you say, just that process was just getting different people who had different sources or materials or things to write on, who wanted to write on Esrog, and that's how the volume came to be.
I would say it was a two-way process. On the one hand, people would come to us and say, hey, I've got a little something for you about this, or we would come from informal chats. At other times, we would look at the spread of what we have, and we identified sections where we felt we must have something, but there was something missing. We couldn't yet find the person. So sometimes we went searching for just the right person who would be able to cover the particular period at hand, the particular set of images at hand, the particular set of objects. Sometimes we as a team found objects or art that would accompany or illustrate the arguments of a chapter. And sometimes we went looking for somebody to write a chapter all around the amazing art and artifacts and objects that we already had awareness of.
Okay, so first of all, maybe you want to do, so you said it goes about, we'll get to your chapter, but you said it goes from ancient times to modern times. Do you want to mention all or some, just tell the listeners about what the various chapters are about and who the authors are before we get to your chapter? I will say also for listeners that there'll be a link in the show's notes where you can purchase the book and you can see the table of contents. I put a tweet. It's in a tweet that I put up, but maybe you want to just read it out, just to tell the listeners about what you mean by that, from ancient times to modern times. The book kind of covers everything, so to speak.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So the book is made up of 18 chapters, and across these 18 chapters, we really do try to start with the very earliest references to the history of the Etrog. People who are sort of familiar with the psukim in the Torah might know that the Etrog is a name that isn't mentioned in the Torah, for example. It's called the Pri Etz Hadar. The Chachamim of the Gemara had to find different ways to explain how we know that the Pri Etz Hadar is the Etrog. And so we decided to go all the way back. Our chapters start with the botanical elements of ancient times, move to the way the Etrog was a symbol during times of the Beis Hamikdash. One of the chapters is a bit of a humorous piece and explores a moment in which Esrogim are thrown at Kohanim who are involved in the avoda in the Beis Hamikdash. We look at letters to Bar Kokhba during the Bar Kokhba rebellion that involve requests for Esrogim, medical uses of the Etrog that are found in the Kaira Geniza. Apparently, the Etrog was really good at curing bad breath, so it was used for all kinds of different medical purposes beyond just its ritual mitzvah purpose. A chapter on illuminated Hebrew manuscripts that explores the way Etrogim show up in a number of interesting manuscripts from the Middle Ages, sometimes manuscripts that have nothing to do with Sukkot at all, like the Haggadah. A chapter that looks at the economic and social ways the Jews got their hands on Esrogim and distributed them and had different minhagim that worked around them. Sometimes sharing Esrogim from town to town, sometimes finding out that they were lemons. Lots of stories there about the world of the difficulty of getting Etrogim. And this is, I think, like a fundamental question that animated our project, which was how in times before our own did a piece of fruit that is most naturally growing in the Mediterranean region make it into the hands of a diaspora of Jews across the world? How did they get their hands on something across great distances that was not native to their environments and yet was essential for the mitzvahs of Sukkot? That's really the animating question. And a number of the different chapters relate to parts of that question because it inspired both challenges and also great creativity across time and place. And we really felt that we could explore questions of Jewish creativity, of Jewish problem solving, of Jewish interconnectivity, but sometimes clashes, all by looking at the Etrog. The chapters go on. We look at how Christians in the 16th and 17th centuries described the Etrog. We look at rituals that have to do with childbirth and how the Etrog plays a part there. My chapter follows on some of those and looks at the particular role of the Etrog merchant or the Esroger and how he appears in all kinds of different forms of literature. Another chapter explores the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzato's involvement. Others look at Etrog boxes, the Etrog trade from Europe to the New World, American Jews and their relationship to the Etrog in halachic questions in the Kibbutz Dati, in the Zionist movement, and finally, modern and contemporary Etrog containers, and then a story by Shai Agnon, one of Israel's Nobel laureates for literature, who had quite a lot to say about Esrogim as well.
Right, and also I don't know if you mentioned there is the story of the Corfu Esrogim is also in here, right?
Thank you. Yes. Now I should at this point also mention that we wanted to tell fresh and interesting stories, and we didn't want to retell stories that were out there. We touch upon some of the issue of the Corfu Esrogim, but the Corfu Esrogim also is a story that has been told to a degree before, and so we were looking to also flesh out and fill out the picture. I also want to mention that a couple of years ago in Israel in Hebrew, a volume came out called Etrog, The Etrog, and it is a wonderful book about Etrogim as well, that raises a bunch of questions that are so different from the ones we raised in this book. It is largely concerned with really interesting questions about botany, about agriculture, about halacha, really important questions. And so we thought we would produce something that was interested in daily life, in social history, in economics, in visual culture, all as a new point of access for readers.
And I want to mention a couple things about the book. Like I said, we'll get to your chapter, but the book is a little bit bigger than a regular size book. It's kind of almost a coffee table size, so to speak. It's full of everything's in color. So there's color photographs of whatever it is, the Esrogim, boxes, paintings, manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts, Kinkasim. We'll get to everything. And I'll put a link, but it's $35. So very, very, very well priced and very affordable. I will say for listeners, it's really a fascinating book. I've read a fair bit of it. So I wanted to mention that. And now another thing is there is an introduction as well from the editors. And that introduction kind of what you just did there, right? The introduction kind of covers what the book, walks through the book and gives an overview of the Esrog and of the Torah and the basic Chazal. It kind of goes through kind of a nice broad overview, right? Is that what the introduction tries to do?
That's exactly right. We try to frame the collection of essays in this chapter book by exploring and also paying attention to some of the bigger themes in the history of the Etrog, paying attention to the way medieval Parshanim explained the psukim of the Etrog, to think about some of the ways that that the Kabbalists would talk about Etrogim, to think about the symbolism of Etrogim, and then to zoom out and think about all of the ways that talking about the Etrog were sometimes at odds with actually getting your hands on one. We hope that the book represents both of those facets, both the realness, the materiality of the Etrog and its protection and its preservation itself, but also the ways people talked about, thought about, and portrayed Esrogim at that.
Okay, so let's turn to your chapter. This is chapter 10, the Esroger, risk, reward, and ridicule. Who is the Esroger? And which, let's also say, tell us what time period are we discussing? Mainly your chapters focus on who is an Esroger, how did he attain this position, what's going on over here?
Great. Thanks for asking the question. This chapter is the one that's really born out of that kind of serendipitous discovery of mine in the archives. I started going down a bit of a rabbit hole to try to understand how the Jews of Prague got Etrogim in the late 17th and early 18th century. I'm a historian of 17th and 18th century Prague, of the early modern period more generally, the years between about 1500 and 1800 in Europe. And I thought it would be interesting to just try to understand more about this figure. And as I started looking for how Etrogim arrived in a city like Prague, I realized that, as any of your listeners will be able to think for themselves, it's quite a logical thing. There had to have been a particular person who was the importer. After I continued to scratch at it, I read through Pinkasim, I read through takkanos of the Kehillot of Prague and others around it, and understood that the person who imported Etrogim was not just an individual entrepreneur, but was often somebody who was an appointed member of the Kehilla, just like a chazan and a shoichet was, somebody who really held a very formal role, which tells us just how important getting Etrogim was for the Kehilla. They didn't rely on somebody's individual initiative. It was a guaranteed service that the Kehilla took on for itself to ensure that Etrogim would arrive in each community in time for Sukkot. And this figure was called an Esroger, or an Etroger, the person who would bring Etrogim from the Mediterranean, usually from northern Italy, like from Genoa, and would once a year in the early summer travel down to the Mediterranean across the Alps from places like Prague, from French Alsace, from Krakow in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Each community tended to have their own individual Esroger who would travel away from home, usually around July, end up in a Mediterranean port, would negotiate prices, would oversee their collection, and then would bring them back to the individual Kehillas for them to be distributed first to the rabbi of the Kehilla, then to the other important parnasim of the Kehilla, and then onwards to other people who had paid for them.
So you mentioned it was a communal position. So that means he was appointed by the community, or was he paid a salary like other, or was he? This is something. Who made the profit on this Esrogim? How did that work?
Great question. He was indeed paid a salary in some cases. In other cases, it does appear that he made his profit based on the fixing of prices. So he seems like it was something of an in-between job. It's clear that his official place in the community was both to ensure that the community would get Etrogim, but also to make sure that his activities were regulated. A kind of quality control on the one hand, to make sure that he was bringing good Etrogim, and also to make sure that he wasn't overcharging the community, because, as we can imagine, somebody who's importing this indispensable and otherwise inaccessible ritual mitzvah object could, in theory, really take advantage of the other people holding a monopoly on this. And so there's a very delicate ground in between making sure that the community got them and making sure that they were accessible for the community at that. He was both regulated, but also a guaranteed person that was going to bring these Etrogim back to the community in each of these places.
Yeah, and something that you point out here that's very interesting is he was regulated, but he was leaving, right? You said he was traveling. He was going to Italy. He was going to other places. So it's hard to regulate him when he's just leaving. So how did that work out?
That's absolutely right. He was often a figure that the community really had to trust. And sometimes that trust was well placed, and at other times that trust could be violated. One of the most exciting documents that I got to work with was a Purim spiel, possibly one of the earliest Purim spiels that we have that have survived, that is not about Purim at all, but rather is just a good comedic play that was put on at Purim time. And the main character of the Purim spiel is an Esroger. And the sense of the spiel is actually of two different Esrogers who are competing with each other to peddle their wares in a given town. We don't know which town, but of course it's fiction, so it doesn't have to be about a specific place. And they hurl insults back and forth at each other, all mocking, impugning the trust and credibility of the other person. The Yiddish audiences that must have listened to these must have known, must have identified with the jokes you can't get a good chuckle out of people if they don't know what you're talking about at all. They must have been in on the joke that the Esroger was somebody that they relied upon, but also was somebody that they had to trust and didn't always know if this person was trustworthy. And so throughout the story of the Esroger, there is once again a tension of necessity, regulation, reliance, and suspicion. All kinds of tensions come to the fore about how a community would operate that revolve around this character.
So what were the civil authorities' involvement here? You have there's actually a really nice reproduction and color of a privilege granted of one of the emperors to Esroger. So how did they come into this?
Good. As an additional part of the story, both community and Esrogers would look to the power of non-Jewish territorial authorities to regulate their trade, to help them resolve disputes, and just as importantly, to also protect them during the long and treacherous journeys from their home, Kehilla, to a distance far away. They would often need a kind of pre-modern version of a passport to guarantee that their physical safety on the road was happening under the umbrella of protection of the highest authority in the land. That was one of the nicer parts. Sometimes when different Esrogers were at odds with each other or the Kehilla or had scores to settle based on earlier feuds, they could tattle on one or another. They could speak ill of each other. And in some cases, the authorities got involved, threw Esrogers into prison, sometimes took all the Esrogim and imprisoned them as well until they could be ransomed for an appropriate customs and duty fee. So the plot thickens all along the way. I should also say, though, that the Esroger, as somebody who had to travel to different places, was usually somebody who mastered more than one language. They needed to be able to communicate all along the road that they would travel from home to far away. And we have at least one surviving source that tells us that a polyglot, an Esroger who spoke multiple languages, was important in one case in which a Jew was imprisoned under false pretenses because he had been slandered by a different Jew in the community, and a fact-finding mission to ultimately exonerate, to prove the innocence of this imprisoned Jew, was conducted by the Esroger because he was the one who had the most linguistic talent and was capable of bringing together stories from all kinds of different languages. He was a valuable figure, a kind of hero, and this is preserved in a family Megillah from early modern Prague. I guess Purim figures into Sukkot in a bunch of ways. A Purim spiel, a family Megillah. There's all kinds of connections across the calendar year.
Another thing that you have in here, one of the pages in your articles, a full reproduction of actually a really beautiful handwriting, very legible, from the Pinkus from the Parnasim, an Ashkenazi community in Amsterdam, from a statuette from 1713 about basically not allowing anyone to buy from anyone else, and he would have to bring his crates to them. I mean, what was this? What did this Pinkus talk about? How did you come across this Pinkus?
Good question. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that references to this Pinkus were supported by two of the other contributors to this volume, by Jordan Katz, who has a wonderful chapter called The Allure of the Stem, the Pitum as Protection in Childbirth, and by David Sklar, a merchant Kabbalist. Moses Chaim Luzzatto sells Esrogim in Amsterdam. Both of these scholars work on archives from the Amsterdam community, and they, in their travels, came across this interesting element of the Pinkas. So I should also say, we would also swap material one with the other. We would say, this is really good for your chapter. Why don't you take this source? This is really good for yours. Why don't you take that? And so we would share. It was really a collaborative volume where we would share material with each other so that the strongest possible outcome for the total book would emerge. So they shared this source that they had found that told us about the distribution of and the regulation of Etrogim. And as readers who will encounter the chapter will see, maybe I'll even read some of the sentences out loud. A 1713 statute from the Ashkenazi community of Amsterdam issued a blanket prohibition on the purchase of Etrogim from anyone other than the officially appointed Esroger. They insisted upon the first rights of inspection, prohibiting the Esroger from showing his wares to anyone else before them, and demanding that his sealed crates be brought to the communities Beit Kehilla, whereupon 12 Etrogim would be set aside for communal synagogue use before the rest were distributed to individuals. It's clear that the leaders of the Amsterdam community were very concerned, on the one hand, to maintain hierarchies, on the other hand, to regulate prices. They didn't want anybody to outbid them. And on the other hand, to make sure that even though a hierarchy was at work, that Etrogim would still be accessible to everyone. 12 would be put in the shul that would be available for everyone to use before they were sold to highest bidder individuals. And so the Etrog also represents a delicate balance between community hierarchy and authority and yichus on the one hand, but also making sure that there's accessibility to this important object of Hidur Mitzvah on the other.
Right, and there's another thing that I don't think you mentioned yet, is that there was this kind of also something. There was also not only you mentioned the two Esrogers, the Jewish Esrogers fighting, but there also was the Jewish-Christian relationship here. That's something that also played. There was the part of that is part of the story, right?
Great, you're absolutely right. There's certainly times in the city of Prague, as well as in other places, there are times when, because the Etrog is also a real economic object, there's money at stake. It's an industry with a monopoly. It's good right up until a particular moment, and it's basically worthless after the Chag. So there's a time constraint. There's a resource constraint. At times, both Christians and Jews would participate in this sort of market, sometimes as competitors and sometimes as collaborators. Certainly in Prague, there were times when the emperor himself and the Prague Jewish community made deals that required Jews to only purchase Etrogim from Jews and not Christian merchants. At other times, Christians lobbied the emperor for the right to also sell Etrogim because they recognized that it was an economically lucrative object. In some of the other chapters that appear in the volume, in the chapter on the Ottoman Empire and on Corfu by Constanze Kolb, the chapter is chapter 12, called Between Global Trade and National Identity, the Adriatic Etrog Trade in the 19th Century. The author, Constanze Kolb, looks at places where Jews and Christians at times cooperated with each other in order to make sure the Etrog supply chain was always in motion. But this also required other careful systems of supervision, agents who were placed along the way to make sure that the inspection process happened properly, that they were plucked from trees that weren't morkov, that weren't grafted elements. And in time, this also supplied, when crates were sealed, they would have certificates that were attached to them that would tell people at different stages just how carefully the oversight had gone.
Okay, so one mainly final question about your chapter about the Esrog. I mean, how common was this position? Was this something mainly in big communities like in Prague that had it, or what about was it the small community, so to speak? There's Teplitsky, right? The small community. How did this work exactly?
Thank you. We've got evidence from the Pinkasim of the Vad Arba Otsot in Poland, Lithuania, the Council of Four Lands, a large governing institution for Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, of regulation of the work of the Esrogers that would cross space, that would, on the one hand, support individual larger communities, but that would also move from smaller communities to make sure that they were distributed across large rural areas. Similarly, in Western Europe, in French Alsace and Strasbourg, in places along the French and German border, we also have evidence of not a single Esroger for each little community or each little cluster of Jews who didn't even live in what we might think of as a community today, but were rather a kind of virtual community with each other. They would pass the Etrog from settlement to settlement, sometimes sharing one with 5 communities. And I'd invite people to look at the really interesting chapter by Professors Debra Kaplan and Edward Fram called The Four Species in Pre-Modern Europe, Views from East and West, where they work with autobiographies and minhag books from the period to explore some of the ways that little dotted families across the countryside who didn't even have a minyan, most Shabbases, for example, would find ways to ensure that they had an etrog that they could share with other families near and far.
So last question on your chapter is, I know you're 17th, 18th century historian, but do we know when this Esroger went until? I mean, when did things kind of change later? I don't know if you know that, like, did something change, or this is something that just went on and then stopped eventually?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure we would even say that it has stopped yet. Of course, we don't have necessarily an official Kehilla that grants them monopoly, but all the way into certainly the 20th century, and in many ways right into our own time, the people who import Etrogim for us just before Sukkot are really, really important figures. They set the prices, they make sure there's a supply, they guarantee a kind of hashgacha over the process, and a kind of variation of this process is still, I think, alive and well in our own time too.
Okay, so that's with your chapter, and like I said, there'll be a link in the show's notes for anyone interested in purchasing can read it. So one other thing that I want to ask you is there's a lot of materials in here. Like I mentioned, there's pinkasim, there's manuscripts, there's illuminated manuscripts. There's in your article, there's actually a really cool stamp, a seal of an Esrog merchant from Trieste in the early 20th century. It's actually really interesting to see it reproduced beautifully in color. There's a lot of other materials. There's art. There's Esrog box. I mean, you can talk about what else is in here and how did you get these materials and where did you get these materials?
I'm so glad that you asked this question. There's well over 100 images that illustrate and breathe life into the words in the chapters. In fact, I think a casual browser can even just have fun flipping from color image to color image to color image. I wish that readers would turn to the last pages of the whole book and look at the credits. The credits are a story in and of themselves that reveal the tremendous collaboration that took place, without which this book couldn't have come together, of people who had treasures, who were willing to share them with us, private collections, libraries around the world, museums, artist galleries, individuals who all had little nuggets, or sometimes big ones, of beautiful, rare, remarkable visual material. Designers, artists, metal workers, the list goes on, all people who were generous enough to share with us the fruits, pardon the pun, of their collecting and labor activities, and were prepared to share them with us so that we could include them in a volume like this.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining me to discuss the book and your chapter in the book.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so for this part of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Debra Kaplan, who is Professor of Jewish History at Bar Ilan, and we'll be discussing her chapter in the book that she co-authored with Professor Edward Fram, which is Chapter 7, The Four Species in Pre-Modern Europe, Views from East and West. So thank you, Professor Kaplan, for joining me once again on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start off. What is the time period that's under discussion? When exactly is your chapter discussing?
So Professor Fram and I wrote this together, and we began our work in the Middle Ages, starting in the 12th century, and we go up to the end of the 18th century, and we cover both Western and Eastern Europe, so all the way from France to Poland and Lithuania. Okay, so let's start with the Middle Ages. So what was from the sources that we have, what was the availability or the lack thereof and the hardship of getting Arba Minim and Esrog? So one of the really interesting things when you look at the Esrog historically is this question of how it's different from what we know today, whether in America or in Israel. And in Europe, only Aravos grew locally. The other three minim had to be imported from elsewhere. And I think we sort of got a sense during the coronavirus of the fact that supply chains could be interrupted and that everything that we wanted wasn't always available. And so too, the other three minim that did not grow locally in Europe were not always available. And so just as one example, Rabbeinu Tam, who lived in France in the 12th century, discusses what happens when you don't have any access to an esrog at all. And what he rules is that you can take the other three minim and you can make a bracha on them, but only on the second day, because of the biblical precept talks about bringing these four minim together on the first day. You don't have four, so you can make a bracha on the second day. And this is already indicating to us that Rabbeinu Tam saw instances in which it was just impossible to get an esrog at all for the first day of Sukkot. Another example comes from another one of the Balei HaTosfot, Rabbi Eliezer of Metz. And he actually rules that you can use a dried lulav and dried hadassim, which shows us that there were years in which communities could simply not get a fresh lulav and fresh hadassim. It seems so strange. It seems so different. And yet this was very much the norm in medieval and early modern Europe.
You actually draw a interesting parallel to medieval Christians at that time period who had an issue with Palm Sunday. I mean, many listeners probably not familiar with Palm Sunday, so maybe you want to elaborate a little bit there, and you draw this out in the chapter explaining the parallels here.
Yes. So Palm Sunday is a Sunday that commemorates when Jesus went to Jerusalem to the temple. And the New Testament talks about palms being thrown before him or olive branches. And so Christians use palms or olive branches on Palm Sunday in their service. But just like the lulav, which is a palm frond, was not available to the Jews of Europe, so too the Christians also had a very hard time finding palms. And we have many different examples of this in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. In England, we see examples where people were using yew instead of palms. Orthodox churches in Poland used willows. And it's just a whole new way of thinking, I think, about produce and plants and what is available locally and what is not available locally. Jews also have this issue on Pesach. It's the exact same thing with Maror. One of the things we see emerging during this time period is the custom of using horseradish as Maror, what we call chazaras today. The green leaves specified by the Mishnah were not available in Europe. And so we see people adopting horseradish. So we see all of these switches in and out based on what is available locally for Jews and for Christians.
Right. It's an interesting parallel just to show how there was this lack of what they were looking for was not always available. So you mentioned about the dried out Arba Minim. I mean, you talk a little bit more, right? There's some dried out Arba Minim, and even I think there's a source you have to sometimes use last year's lulav. I mean, they really sometimes just didn't have.
Absolutely. There's a lot of hardship of acquiring different Arba Minim. The lulav is one of them. So, for example, Benjamin Slonik, a rabbi in 16th century Poland, ruled that you could use a dried lulav. You have the Nohag Ketzon Yosef Kosman of Frankfurt in the 18th century, who cites that ruling and talks about the fact that people used lulavim that were a year old. They were dried out, and this was common. We also see in communal records, such as Pinkasim and other sources, communal Sifrei Minhagim, custom books, where people actually used dried lulavim. This was part of the normal expectations of the pre-modern European Jewish communities, that they would not always have fresh lulavim, and certainly not for everyone. Another really good example of this actually comes from hadassim, and I think today people try very hard to get the most mehudar set of Arba Minim that they can possibly get. And, when you're a young kid in school, you learn all the different ways to find a kosher one and then a mahudar one. And one of the things we all know about hadassim is that when you have the three leaves of the myrtle branch, the point at which they all come onto the branch, should you be able to put a straight line through them. And everybody looks through I remember being a little kid in Brooklyn and looking through where the three leaves reach together. And we have Rabbi Yisrael Israelite in the 15th century who lived not far from Vienna in Wiener Neustadt. And he said, nobody's careful with this minhag. And it's interesting because when he says this, it's because nobody could be careful with this minhag. Nobody could even hope to necessarily get fresh hadassim. They were using sometimes hadassim from the previous year. And you can contrast this with Rav Yosef Karo, who of course lived in Tzfat. And he rejects Israelite psak completely and says, no, absolutely, you need to have those kind of hadassim. But he lives in Tzfat, which until today is a place where you can always get fresh hadassim. So you can see in the different approaches of the different rabbis, there are different geographic circumstances, what was available and what was not. So I think that's a really interesting piece of all of this.
Yeah, when hadassim are meshulish, everyone's always checking for the different.
Always checking. Not in 15th century Wiener Neustadt. So
yeah, exactly. So is there? I mean, you mentioned how the chapter, you both work on east to west. Was there any difference? Was it easier in east, France and Germany versus sorry, that's west, but east in Poland, Lithuania? Was it easier in either one, or was it the same hard? With any differences between them?
Well, we see a lot of the same patterns, and one of the wonderful things about working together was with Professor Fram was when we compared our sources from East and West and our rabbinic sources and our communal sources, we saw many of the same trends of where Esrogim were sold, how they would be imported, and the different struggles that people had. So I wouldn't say there was a big difference between East and West, but I would say that larger communities had different challenges than smaller communities, and we can get into a deeper discussion of where people got their Esrogim from and how they brought their Esrogim in. But many of the things that we see in Poland and Germany and France are actually quite parallel to one another. So it's not so different, because in both areas, the only plant that is native of the Arba Minim are the willows, the aravos, and not any of the other three minim.
Yeah, so before we get into where people got the Esrogim and Arba Minim from, just something you do discuss in here, which is an issue, right, is Morkov, grafted Esrogim, and there's you mentioned Shuvah Marsh, Molkaz and Elbog, and there are others. There's a big discussion here. So what do you have to say about that?
So the issue of Morkov, of the grafted Etrog, comes up, I think, in the context in which it's so difficult for everyone to procure an Esrog in Europe altogether. And in that world, the question of a Morkov Esrog seems like a really good possibility to consider, especially as we saw, Rabbi Tam is already talking about a year where you can't get an Esrog at all. So a Morkov Esrog sounds a lot better than no Esrog. So the Ramah, who lives in Poland in the 16th century, writes to his cousin, this is the tshuva that you mentioned, his cousin Rav Shmuel Katzenellenbogen, who lives in Padua in Italy. And Italy is where many of the Esrogim are from. And he asks his cousin Katzenellenbogen, what do you think about these grafted Esrogim? Because there are people who are using grafted Esrogim in Poland. And Katzenellenbogen writes back, and he says he was familiar with this practice of people using the Morkov, but he himself didn't permit it. And we see this in other tshuvat as well. And anybody who's really interested in this issue can look at our chapter. We see several Polish rabbis who knew that some people were using the Morkov. Most of them prohibited it. But there were a few that did rule that it was permissible to use the Morkov Etrog, the grafted Esrog. Among them, one of the Dayanim of Lviv and the Bach, who said it's preferable to use a pure Esrog, but actually for various reasons, because the Morkov has many of the same traits as an Esrog, they sort of say that it's permissible b'diavad to use this Morkov Esrog. So I think it's really interesting in the context, again, of the availability, the question of what can people use? How can they fulfill this very important mitzvah under circumstances that are totally different than the ones that we know today? And I think that's really an interesting way to think about some of these discussions in the various sources that we have.
Yeah. So now when we go past that of the availability, but when it was available, purchasing the Esrog and Arba Minim. So there's a couple of questions here. I'm not sure where you want to start, right? There's who bought the Esrog? Was it the community? Was it the individual? How did they get it? Who paid for it? Where did they get it from? Okay, so I'm throwing out a lot of stuff, but let's start off, I guess, just a first overarching question. Where were these Esrogim coming from? Now, I don't know, perhaps it's different from East and West, but where were the Esrogim coming from?
So to the best of our knowledge, many of the Esrogim come from Italy. And one of the most clear sources that I found on this topic was a source from the Jewish community of Ahu, Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek, which we have talked about together on this podcast before. And that community brought their Esrogim from Italy to up through Nuremberg, where there actually was not a Jewish community at the time, and then farther north to Hamburg. And that's one route, and I think that happens a lot. But what we actually see, and I'm sure we talked about this also with Professor Teplitsky, are these Esrog sellers, these Esrogiers, who are traveling to various fairs. And it's actually at the fair that many people are coming to buy, many people or communities, and we can talk about that in a moment, were coming to buy the Esrogim to then distribute elsewhere. And one of the things that's really important to think about when we think about this is, for example, take the example of Frankfurt. And here, the timing of the fairs is different in Poland and Germany. So maybe I'll say a word about that. But one of the most famous fairs in Frankfurt, which actually still meets today, the book fair, is the Frankfurt Fair. And it's very close to Rosh Hashanah. In fact, the Jewish sources call it always the Yerid Rosh Hashanah. Obviously, it's a fair open to Jews and Christians from all over Europe. And its official name is not Yerid Rosh Hashanah, but if you read a Pinkas, that's what it's called. We'll see you at the Yerid Rosh Hashanah. And you can imagine that if you're a close enough community that someone could go around Rosh Hashanah time to get the Esrogim and then bring it back to the communities, this is a wonderful opportunity for an Esrog seller. I'll just jump to Poland for a minute about different takkanot, about fairs. In Poland, one of the big fairs is the Yaroslav Fair, and that's about 3 weeks long, and it starts in mid-August. Now, there you have a little bit of an issue, because according to the way the calendar was structured in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the calendar also changes then, it's a little bit of a complicated issue. Sukkot can start as early as mid-September. So if the fair starts in mid-August, you don't always have enough time to get from Yaroslav to some of those more distant places. And so the rabbis of Poland ruled that the Esrog merchants had to arrive before the beginning of the fair so that everyone who came to buy Esrogim, and these are not necessarily individuals, but often communities who come and send a representative to bring them Esrogim, they can get back to these more distant communities with enough time to get there for Sukkot. And so the fairs are very, very important in Jewish history more broadly. It's a time where rabbis can come together. It's a time where different takkanos were made. It's a time where different communal debts between communities are paid. And this is also a time where Esrogim are sold, bought, and then set on the trail for delivery to other communities. So that's really the way that Esrogim come, usually through Italy to the fairs and then dispersed from there. That's the main trend that we see. But you also have these Esrog merchants who themselves bring Esrogim aside from the fair to various communities, but that I'm sure we talked about in a different part of this podcast.
Yeah, that was discussed with Professor Teplitsky. So maybe we'll mention some more takkanos and things that are done by the fairs. But what about, I know that the book is titled The Esrog, but what about the other arguments? What about hadassim and what about lulavim? Do we know where those came from, and were those done, kind of this distributed, so to speak, the same way through the fairs?
So the source that I found, most of the sources that we have talk about Esrogim at the fairs, and that's the main focus. And the ravos, as I said, grow locally. So we're really talking about the other three, the lulav, the hadath, and the esrog. The best source, as I said before, that I found was from Ahu, and they were the ones who ordered from Italy, and then it traveled north into the Nuremberg area, and then farther north to Ahu itself, which is pretty far north in Germany. And it's really interesting. There we have very, very detailed takkanos more broadly, and so it really gives us a deeper window into some of the mechanics, which may have been similar to other communities, may have been a little different because Ahu is such a big and important community in this time. They actually order 70 Esrogim and lulavim, which is a tremendous amount. And we can talk about that in a little bit. And they order Esrogim and lulavim, 70 of each, and they order 140 hadassim. Now you can think to yourself, how could that possibly be if that doesn't make a sense, right? The math is off. You should have 210 hadassim if you have 70 lulavim. I know every listener is saying, what? Is she making a mistake? I'm not making a mistake. This is already showing you that some people are using last year's hadassim. Not everyone's getting hadassim. Here you have it. It's the numbers. And what they do is they place them into labeled bags for the Sephardic community of Hamburg, also for the Ashkenazi community of Ahu. And then when the bags come, the lay leaders unpack them. And each community, as you asked before, communities and individuals, we should talk about that. Each community receives a set number of stacks of Esrogim, lulavim, hadassim. They have other hadassim from the years before, other lulavim too, I would bet. They divide them up. And that's how they get the Arba Minim. So these two are probably purchased in the same way, but in all the records that I've read about fairs, and this is just my reading, my own personal reading, I have never seen mention of lulav or hadassim except for this one text. But I assume that sometimes Esrog could be maybe shorthand for some of the other minim as well. Certainly in Ahu, they get it from the same source.
Okay, so back to the Esrogim.
Yes.
And really, it's really all the Arba Minim. You just mentioned Ahu, but so who was buying them? I mean, was it the community? Were there individuals getting them? And does it differ? Does it depend on the community?
So it's actually very interesting. So if we go back to what I said at the very beginning, there are so few Esrogim available. And it's very hard. You're importing them. They're not a fruit that grows on somebody's tree that you can just pick off. And so we're talking about something that's more effortful to bring in and that's not always available. Because of this, and also because of other factors, which I'll mention in a moment, it was often the case that a community bought an esrog or several esrogim that would be shared by everyone. And this was a communal esrog. Now, this varies. In a place like Frankfurt, where there's a fair and people are coming selling esrogim, more esrogim are available. So there, rabbis suggest that individuals who can afford it buy their own set of Arba Minim. But in other places, there's no discussion of this because it would just not be possible to bring in so many different esrogim, so many different lulavim, etc. And so it's only for the community. Now, the other aspect of this is not just the scarcity of how many esrogim and lulavim or hadassim there are, but it's also an issue of pricing. How much do esrogim cost? And this is something I think that's very familiar to our listeners. in Ahu, for example, and I found pricing of Esrogim for several communities, but I'll just give the example of Ahu. They purchased 4 communal Esrogim. This is not the 70 that I mentioned before. Of those, this is a different year, but also they sometimes purchase more, and those go to individuals, which I'll say more about in just a moment. But they purchased, just the price of 4 communal Esrogim is 12 Reichstaler, which means absolutely nothing to everybody who's listening to this podcast. So to give you a sense, what is 12 Reichstaler? It's the same price as 300 pounds of flour. In other words, it's a fortune. So for a Kehilla to buy communal Esrogim costs a lot of money. And now we have to think, well, where does the Kehilla get the money from to buy these communal Esrogim? And there's another issue related to that, which is how do you even buy a communal Esrog? So let's divide that into 2. First of all, we have a halachic issue. The verse in the Torah says, "Ulekachtem lechem b'yom harishon," and we all know "Ulekachtem lechem" means it has to belong to you. So how on earth, if it's a Kehilla Esrog, it belongs to the whole community, how do you fulfill the halachic precept of it having individual belonging? So what communities do is they require every single tax-paying community member to pay into the Esrog pot. It's like an Esrog tax. And it's actually wonderful. In one of the archives that I worked in for the city of Darmstadt, there was actually a list of every single person in the community and how much they paid toward the Esrog. And it had to do with their economic status and their general tax assessment rate. And they write down what every single taxpayer, man or woman, the women that were taxpayers are widows, what they paid in. And this tax, which included all of the official members of the community, meant that everybody had a share. So everyone could say, "Ulekachtem lachem." So that's one factor for just how this works, the communal Esrogim piece of it. But now let's think about the question of the pricing. If you have a large community and a lot of taxpayers who are wealthier, you might be able to buy more communal Esrogim. But if you're a small community and you don't have a lot of income from your taxes, you can't afford to buy so many Esrogim. You also need fewer Esrogim to pass around the Kehilla. And so it's actually a very interesting thing. We have, for example, in Bialystok in the 17th century, they start off with 2 communal Esrogim, and as the community grows, they move up to 4. They can afford more, and they also need more. And so we see a range of different Kehillos buying different amounts, different numbers of communal Esrogim, and I would say here sets of Arba Minim, because of course they're not just buying the Esrog. And basically we have examples of 2, of 3, of 4, even of 6 Esrogim or sets. Now they're not always buying a set. Sometimes, and the communal records are clear about this, they're using an old last year's lulav, but a new Esrog, because you can't, of course, use a dried out Esrog. And so we see a little bit of a mix and match, but the size of the community, its wealth, and also its proximity to the fairs all determine the number of communal Esrogim that are purchased. I just add to this that in addition, you also have Kehillot, and this goes back to Hamburg and those 70 Esrogim and Levim. They also are buying some sets or some Esrogim, if not complete sets or some partial set, that they're going to then give to or sell to individual people. So you have a mix. In some Kehillas, you have only a communal Esrog. In some, you'll have a mix where some people are using the communal Esrog and others are using individual Esrogim and Lulavim. And that, again, depends on availability, proximity, ability to pay, etc.
So there's a lot of things to follow up on there, but just to start, do you have any of these communities? It could be any one. How big the community was, and how many Esrogim sets of Arba Minim they had? Meaning, was it like 2 sets for 1,000 people? I mean, what was? Do we have any communities? Do you have any numbers?
I can give for one community that data. That's one of the communities that I work on, the community of Worms in Germany. And in the 17th century, they have around 700 people there, including that men, women, and children. So all ages. That's what the census lists. You have a Christian who went house to house and counted all of the Jews. And that's how I can give you that number of approximately 700, but I haven't gone through that list. And in another document, one of the Pinkasim that I worked on, it explains that they ordered 3 Esrogim. So they have 3 sets of communal Esrogim and Lulavim. They actually didn't buy 3 Lulavim every year. They sometimes use one from last year. At least one set had last year's Lulav. But in terms of sets of Arba Minim, they had 3 sets of Arba Minim. Now, they also ordered some individual ones for individuals to use and purchase. But just in terms of the Kehilla Esrogim and sets, They're passing it around 3 sets per 700 people. So
wow,
it's a lot to think about.
Yeah, and we'll get to that shortly. I want to get to that. Is that how was it actually done? These 3 sets for 700 people, just as one number example, probably was similar to other communities, and everyone has to get this, the Arba Minim. Okay, so you mentioned a little bit about paying for it, but let's discuss that a little more. So you said it was a tax. So who was paying for it? Was it everybody? Were the women paying for it? You said if there were women taxpayers part of the Kehilla, were they paying for it? Were the richer people paying more money for it? How did that work?
So essentially, when we're talking about the Esrog set of the Kehilla, every single person who had membership in the community would be a taxpayer. If you look at different communities, there are people that are official community members, and then people who live there but are not officially communal members. They don't have what we call cheskat kahal. They don't have that status of being a member. Anybody that has cheskat kahal has to pay a certain degree of taxes. And the way that taxes are calculated in this period, I'm talking now not about taxes to the Christian government, but taxes internally to the Kehilla itself. Essentially, they would do every 3 years, every 5 years. It depends on the Kehilla. It's usually 3. They would do an assessment where everybody would talk about their net worth, and certain things were excluded. If you were marrying off a child, then they gave you a deduction for that. They didn't always count your svarim as your net worth, so that's something to think about. Also, they would calculate how much you had, and then they would determine your tax rate. And what we see that they did in terms of the Esrogim was that they calculated, here's the cost of a communal Esrog, and they divided it in the same proportional way as your taxes were divided. So wealthier people had more obligation for various things, for paying for the shamash, or paying for for what we call the pletin, which is one of the tzedakah mechanisms that we have in the community, and also paying for the Esrogim. And so it was actually done in a way that was parallel to the taxes. And yes, all taxpayers paid this part of the communal taxes to be part of the communal Esrog. It was essential, because otherwise the Esrog wouldn't belong to them, and they wouldn't really be fulfilling the mitzvah of ulakachtem lachem. So this was a very, very important tax if they were going to use the communal Esrog. And so when you have a household headed by a widow, and the widow was the taxpayer, she paid in for those taxes. Absolutely. We have lists, like I mentioned, the list from Darmstadt, and on the list you have almana this and almana that, who paid in for the Esrog tax. We also have mention of this in Metz as well, of the widows who used these Arba Minim and paid for them as well.
Yeah, we can discuss them using them. Okay, so first of all, you mentioned their cheskas kal and other things. So if any listeners want to hear more about that, if you didn't, they refer them back to the previous podcast episode that we did where we discussed that. You mentioned Pinkasim. I did an episode with Professor Leshava Kalbach. So there's other episodes. I'm not going to go more in depth on a lot of this stuff over here. Something else about paying for the Esrogim we should mention here as well is that, and I believe you mentioned this in the chapter, that there are court cases. I mean, for those who listened to your previous episode in Germany, this was serious affairs for those that weren't paying for communal things. So there were court cases that happened, and I've mentioned specific instances and stories when someone didn't pay their Esrog tax.
Yeah. There are some wonderful stories about this, and I won't go into too many details now. And anyone who wants to see them, please read the chapter. And I'm sure we could find many more. All we have to do is look. A couple of court cases appear in the Pinkas Beitzin of Metz, which was published by Professor Jay Berkowitz. And there we see disputes between the Kehilla of Metz and specific community members over the Esrog tax. And I'll bring 2 short examples. In one case, there was a man who was in a broader dispute with the community, and he basically goes and he buys his own Esrog. And he says, when they bring him before the Beis Din and say, you didn't pay the Esrog tax, what's going on here? He says, well, we were in a dispute. I was worried you wouldn't let me use the communal Esrog, so I bought my own Esrog. It sounds like a very pious claim. But the Beis Din actually rules that, of course, he has to pay for the communal Esrog. The expectation is that if you are a member of a community, you are obligated, no matter if you have your own Esrog or not, to pay into this communal Esrog. And remember, Esrogim are expensive. This is a really expensive item. And so they can't have all the wealthy people going and buying their own Esrogim. Then they won't be able to afford the communal Esrog. In another case, there's an inheritance case where Esrogim are mentioned. And after a father dies, his estate's being divided up among his sons and daughters. And the Beis Din has to rule on the different amounts that each sibling will inherit. And as part of that, they also determine, based on the Yerusha that they get, what is their share in the Esrog tax. So each child's share of the Esrog tax was commensurate with his or her share of the Yerusha. Much like what I said about tax assessment, it's all about how much you have to put in. And again, thinking about the context of the expensive Esrogim, the difficulty of obtaining them. It gives us a sense of why it would have functioned this way, why it was so important to ensure that every single community member paid in their share of the tax.
So we discussed really kind of bigger communities. You mentioned owl, you mentioned worms. I mean, these are somewhat bigger communities. What about the small little communities in these small villages with a few Jews? I mean, how did they get Arba Minim?
So I love talking about the small Jewish communities. That was the subject of my first book. And I think it's so important for people to understand that in this time period, there are communities, literally you have one Jewish family, two Jewish families, five Jewish families. It's a totally different way of organizing a community. And obviously they have different challenges in obtaining Esrogim. They're not always close by. They don't always have as much money. They certainly don't need as many Esrogim. And so there are really, really interesting things that we see. There are certain small communities that are sort of satellites, peripheries to a center that's a big Kehilla. So if you take the example of Ahu, there's another small community that's about 13 kilometers away. It's called Harburg. Actually, today Harburg is part of Hamburg. So just to give you a sense of how close it was. So when the 70 Esrogim made their way up from Italy to Hamburg, they sent a couple across the Elbe River, which is right next to Hamburg. They sent a couple to Harburg. But in other cases, it's much, much less simple. And one of the areas that I studied was the area of Alsace, which is today France, and then Germany. And there we have a couple of stories that we actually learn about through a memoir of a Jew named Asher Rechtshoffen about some of the difficulties he had in obtaining Esrogim. And there's some wonderful, very sad, but wonderful, detailed stories about that, which I could share. One story, which is really, I think, my very favorite Esrog story, but also the saddest Esrog story I know. It's 1630. It's the middle of the 30 Years' War, which is from 1618 until 1648, which is this huge war between Protestants and Catholics. It's affecting everyone. And Alsace, as a border region, is really embroiled in so much violence. And this is a major subject of his memoir because he's a chazan and he's a shochet, and his whole life is filled with upheaval because of the violence. He's a mohel. He can't get his way to a bris without being pillaged on the road. And he talks about 1 year where it's just so impossible. There are no Esrogim to be found, and he's heartbroken. He doesn't know what to do. And essentially, two Jews come and they have these two little Esrogim. And it's just a couple of nights before Sukkot. And there's not enough time. There are no rabbis in big communities in the region. There's not enough time to send a shayla to a rabbi in a big community and get the answer back, because it's really just a couple of days before Sukkot. And so he learns in Polish yeshivas. He had certain books in his library. He says, I stayed up all night looking for a way to allow our communities to use these Esrogim. And he says, even though they're small, and he makes a deliberation. He says, I found a way. It's allowed to use this Esrogim. He's so excited. And these Jews are so dedicated. He talks about how he and his neighbors including his town, 4 other communities, so 5 little communities, each one a couple of kilometers from the other, they walk the Esrogim back and forth to make sure that everyone can make the bracha. And they're really going to every. And remember, the roads are full of soldiers. So they're doing their all to do this mitzvah past them. And then it's the last day of Sukkot, and he cuts them open and he finds that they were lemons. So it's like, on the one hand, you see this dedication of these Jews who are doing everything they can. And it's also just a very sad story because in the end, they weren't Esrogim. But just to give a sense, in his situation, it was very, very hard. In another case, during the war, there were no Esrogim at all. And he couldn't bench lulav Esrog at all. And we see that also in other places, even in some of the bigger communities. War could create problems. We saw this in Worms as well, which, as you said, is a big Jewish community. It's not far from Frankfurt. It's about 60 kilometers away. And we have this 1 year, I think it's around the 1620s. I just don't remember it now. It's in the article, in the chapter. And essentially, there's a shaliach who's supposed to bring the Esrogim from the Frankfurt fair to Worms. And every single week he tries to go on the road. And every week it just all falls apart. And he can't get there. And so there are years where people do not have Esrogim. So just to give a sense how this all works.
Wow. Yeah, really. I read that story. That's in there. That's in the chapter. You can see it. So I mean, we mentioned the fairs already. The fairs, affected and the different takkanos related. I don't know if there's anything more you wanted to add about that, or we kind of discussed that. And there's things mentioned in the chapter as well. So now these Esrogim come to the community. I don't know if we mentioned this, how they're distributed in the community. But I guess really the question really is like in use. So the people come, they're going to use them now. How are they used? How are they distributed amongst them? We did that example of, I think it was 3, right, for 700 people. So how did that process go about?
So I'll say 2 very brief things. In some of the larger communities, they have communal Esrogim, but they also have individual Esrogim. And in those communities, they have a lottery. So if you win in the lottery, you get to have your own individual Esrog, and you don't have to use the communal Esrog. So that's just an interesting thing to think about. In some places, the Parnasim, the lay leaders, got access to those Esrogim, and they didn't have to be part of the lottery. So the Esrog becomes a status symbol. But what about everyone else who has to use the communal Esrog? Basically, what we see happening in the sources is that the Chazan always is using the communal Esrog. And in cases where there are other Esrogim, they're given out to the communities, but they have to have it in an orderly fashion. And I would say my second favorite Esrog story is one from Worms. It's told by Yuspa Shamash, who's the Shamash of the community. And he explains that they have 3 sets, as I mentioned earlier, and that the Chazan has 1 set during Hallel. He says the bracha right before Hallel. And then essentially they have 2 other sets. And it's actually a kibud that people can buy. They can be mechobad with being the first to bench the Esrog and Lulav. And what's interesting is you buy this as a couple. So the man gets, the man in the couple is the first on the men's side, and the woman is the first in the women's synagogue. And then after that, it gets passed from seat to seat between all the adults. And then the children of the Kehilla bench after the adults. So I think it gives us a really interesting sense of how this was organized and the prestige associated also with being able to be the first or to have your own, or it's something they really, really valued. Both men and, as we see in this story, women as well, getting this kibud.
Although I think there is a story mentioned, in especially at least in one community, that the woman didn't do it in shul. They made the woman have to do it at home, right?
Yes, that's in first in the 18th century. They make a takkanos saying women should not bench in shul, and also not in the courtyard outside shul, and they tell them to do it at home. But I think no matter how you want to read this, and we need a lot more time to discuss it, already in medieval Europe, we see women are benching lulav and esrog and paying for it, as you mentioned. So we see their involvement in this mitzvah in different ways in different places.
Yeah, absolutely. They're definitely involved. Like I said, they're definitely using the Arba Minim. They're paying for it, and that's just one community that you mentioned and you discuss in the chapter. Okay, so at this point, it's after Sukkot, the Arba Minim will use. So what happens now? And we mentioned quite a bit that the lulav, the hadassim, may be stored, so saved for the next year. And first of all, maybe you can discuss how that was done. But I mean, what happens to the Esrog, the Arovas? What happens to the Arba Minim?
I wish I knew where they were stored. I imagine they're stored in the shul, but I did not. I looked so hard to find, and where do they keep it? I don't know where they kept it. I haven't found it yet. But so as you said, the lulav and the hadassim can be stored and used dried for the next year. But there are also other minhagim for how to use them when they are no longer kept. Let's say it's the next year, or they start to deteriorate, they're no longer kosher. So the lulav could be used to create the fire to bake the matzot. It was sometimes used to create the fire to burn the chametz, so using it from one mitzvah to the other. The hadassim, when they got dried or too dry to use, were used for besamim, for the havdalah. And then probably the most interesting thing is what happened with the Esrogim, which of course could not be used year to year. There was a very interesting custom that biting off the tip of the Esrog would lead to fertility. So that was one famous use of the Esrog. And in other places, they marinated the Esrog in sugar and gave out pieces either to the whole Kehilla or to people who were ill. It has also medicinal properties. And there's another chapter in this beautiful book about the medicinal properties of the Esrog, which everybody is welcome to read. But I think just to bring this all full circle, the value that they saw in all these things, and they want to use every last bit of it, shows you how precious the mitzvah was, but also how hard it was to get all of these Arba Minim, and how much they could therefore value it and use it to the very last drop. And I think that speaks also to the challenge they had in procuring them, which I think is very different than what we know today, but a fascinating chapter in Jewish history.
Yeah, so you mentioned the medicinal, that's chapter 5, medical uses of the Etrog in Mediterranean societies by Ephraim Lev and Zohar Amar. And then also the chapter after yours, chapter 8, is the allure of the stem,
Yes.
protection Charlotte, by Professor Jordan Katz. So that really
I recommend everyone read all the chapters of this book. It's a wonderful book. It's just it's a fabulous book. Everyone should.
And as I mentioned on the other parts of this podcast with the other guests, that there's pictures reproduced in color. So there's in your chapter there's facsimile in a picture of the Sefer Menhagim from 1662. There is there's a ledger piece from Darmstadt, and there's a couple of primary sources and things reproduced. I mean, one final thing. I mean, the sources you use, I guess, are mainly, like you said, Pinkasim, and you use kind of, I guess, primary sources. So if anyone wants to read more on this beyond your chapter, it's really the actual primary sources. Really, there's not much else written on it.
No, they can read the primary sources, and certainly for some of your audience, the halachic sources that are cited are accessible, and you can read more about them just to look at the footnotes, and you should be able to find some of the Sheilot and Tshuvo. And anyone that wants to try to read a Ktav Yad of a Pinkas, some of these Pinkasim, but not all of them, are available on the website of the National Library, and you can look for the folio numbers and try to read along the Pinkasim. Unfortunately, not all are scanned, but in various archives and libraries around the world, we can find little traces of the Esrog and stitch together this wonderful history.
Right, and exactly. The Tshuvas in here is cited, so you can actually mention this Sefer Shalos Tshuvas, it's this Tshuva, where it is, you can look it up. Okay, so thank you, Professor Kaplan, for joining me to discuss.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so now for this part of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Zev Eleff, who is the president of Gratz College, and he wrote chapter 14 in the book, once again, that we're discussing, Be Fruitful, the Etrog in Jewish Art, Culture, and History. And his chapter is titled The Etrog Trade in the New World, and he wrote it together with Professor Jonathan Sarna.
So my great teacher, Jonathan Sarna, yeah. It would be interesting to sort of explain how this chapter came to be. So I had written a short article about the role of Zionism in animating and renewing the mitzvah of Arba Minim in the late 19th, early 20th century. I knew quite well, being his student for many years, that Jonathan Sarna had written about the Etrog activity in the beginning of the 19th century. And we thought long and hard about whether or not our histories could be conjoined. And what we found was, no, they could not. That we had to find a way to really rethink how the Etrog history and how our particular slants on this history could be conjoined. And in the end, we found a marvelous way to create a new history of the Etrog. And I've always thought that I've been very taken by another fellow scholar, Annie Poland. She has a wonderful turn of phrase called mitzvah merchants. I've always thought it'd be really, really interesting to write about how different, how the economics of mitzvah making and mitzvah trade plays a role in the religious history of American Judaism. So here's my opportunity.
Okay, so let's jump right into it. So it's right in early America. We're going to go back to early America, United States, I guess in particular, we should say, right? So how were they acquired? How hard were they? Did it depend where they lived? So I guess let's start off on, 18th and 19th centuries.
Right. So remember, things changed dramatically in the year 1840. Why? Because from 1654, when 23 Jews disembarked on the St. Catherine in what was then New Amsterdam, till 1840, there wasn't ever a long-term rabbinical figure placed in what we now call the United States of America. That changes in 1840 with the arrival of Rabbi Abraham Rice. And so before then, Jews who were interested in asking these types of questions, not every Jew was interested in asking shilas, they would have to extend their questions, oftentimes to Solomon Herschel, who was the rabbi of, essentially the chief rabbi before there was a chief rabbi in England, or to lay leaders, juntas, or rabbis in Amsterdam or elsewhere. In fact, one person who weighed on it, not from the American side, but from the European side, was none other than Rabbi Yaakov Ettinger. German Jews asked him whether or not they could import Caribbean Esrogim to Europe. He wasn't a big fan of the idea. I thought that, and this is really important, that mitzvah materials in this hemisphere should come from their hemisphere, and American mitzvah items, Etrog and the like, should can and ought to emanate from their natural ecosystem. But that really changes things when you have all of a sudden poskim, what we would call it today, halachic deciders in the United States beginning in 1840.
Okay, so first you mentioned Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, the Archaner, that's his famous psak in procuring Yaakov. But so going back before that, so let's leave Abraham Rice for a minute. Going before that, so what about, is there, let's say, so before 1840, so even in the 18th century, the 1700s, and in the early 19th century, what was the Esrog situation at that point?
Well, there aren't too many sources, but what we do know is that there were Caribbean Etrogim. Maybe we'll talk about in a little bit. They didn't look exactly. They were skinnier and had a whiter complexion than did our typical lemon-looking Etrogim. And for a while, that was the natural habitat for North American Etrog resource.
Okay, so yeah, so you can mention the Caribbean Esrogim. So where in the Caribbean exactly did they come from, and maybe expound a little bit on how exactly they looked compared to what everyone assumes today. What an Esrog today, everyone picks up an Esrog and they think of an Esrog.
So the major crop in the Caribbean was, of course, sugar. That was where most attention was paid. That was the great economic boom, that resource. But there were Etrogim, they were citrons. They were usually in the wilds, so those who used it were not particularly concerned with morka, that they would be grafted. It was a surplus crop that Jews were happy to know that existed. There were some in California eventually, but the Caribbean was the major source for it. But they looked different. And that's really, really important because and I wrote a book called Authentically Orthodox. Authenticity, how something feels, how something looks, whether or not my grandmother did it that way, is really important for Jews in their ritual. And to pick up an etrog that doesn't necessarily look the way that it might have in Europe seemed to them problematic, no matter what Rabbi Abraham Rice or others would have contended.
Okay, so let's fast forward to 1840. I actually want to, like, as a side, a parenthesis for a second. You mentioned Rabbi Abraham Rice. Abraham Rice, who was Rav in Baltimore. Just mention a little bit about his background, his bio, for the listeners that don't know about him.
Well, Abraham Rice comes. He is a student. We understand it. Pressburg. His relationship with Chassam Sofer. He comes to America. It's a contested sort of thing. When he disembarks from his ship in New York onward to Baltimore, he claims that he's here to hold up the flag of traditional Judaism. I think he might even use the term orthodoxy at that moment. It's not a very popular term back then. Others thought maybe there was an illness in the family. The real reason, and perhaps they're all reasons for why he migrated, but what it really had to do was with increased requirements for the rabbinate, which was a state-authorized position in what today we would call Germany. And Rabbi Rice did not have a college degree. And that meant that he didn't have an opportunity for a stellar in Europe. So the next best thing, although he was a pioneer in this, was to come to the United States. So he comes to Baltimore. Baltimore is a very rabbinical town. I mean that tongue in cheek. It means that the Catholics have deep respect for their ecclesiastical authorities. So Rabbi Abraham Rice in the Baltimore Sun is described as the chief rabbi of the United States. So he enjoys particular rabbinical powers among some, but he actually, from 1840 to 1848, he serves as a rabbi of the one and only congregation there. By 1848, he's had enough. He opens up a drugstore. He comes back into the rabbinate at the very end of his life, and he dies in 1862. He's always, even when he quits the professional rabbinate, he is a major personality in the Jewish press, writing at first only in Hebrew and then in English. Altogether, he is an incredibly important person in the history in American Jewish history.
Now, before we get to the exact Esrog story, you mentioned the Jewish press. The Jewish press at this time, the Occident, Isaac Leeser, if you want to talk a little bit about, because we're going to get to that, right? You want to mention that already here.
So the Occident, Reverend, he was more of a chazan. He wasn't, it's a really strange thing. So he predates, does Isaac Leeser, Abraham Rice. But he doesn't have smicha. I think historians give short shrift to his abilities. This is somebody who translates Chumash into English expertly, the Siddur, both the Sephardic and Ashkenazic rites. He translates Mendelssohn into English. This is a Yodea Sefer. Why do historians not give him the stature he deserves is because his contemporaries, like Rabbi Isaac Meir Wise, didn't think very much of Leeser. Leeser, in some respects, is a sad personality, never married, is the religious functionary of Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia for many years. He is fired, or rather his contract is not renewed in 1850. He is succeeded by Sabato Moreus. And in 1843, he does many firsts in American Jewish life. He is the first long-term monthly periodical, newspaper, magazine, very expensive to buy the entire set. I think Sotheby's had it for auction for over $200,000 a couple of years ago. But he creates this Occident, which in regular parlance means the West. There was Der Orient in Germany, the East, and he meant to be the Western flank of global Jewish life. And one of the platforms was to stand for a term that he started to really embrace was orthodoxy in the United States. And so he becomes one of the early champions of Orthodox Judaism.
Yeah, so of course there's much more to say on Leeser, own episode about Leeser and the Occident. Yes, but okay, so now turning towards what was discussed in the Occident regarding the Esrogim you already alluded to before with Rabbi Abraham Rice and others. So yeah, if you want to relate that story. Rabbi
Rice in 1847 is motivated because he's received a lot of questions and he wants to put an end to the debate. He suggests that Etrogim from the Caribbean are to state these Esrogim are kosher and there cannot be found any word against them in all poskim Rishonim and Achronim. Is exactly what he says in the May 1847 edition of the Occident. It is followed up in the subsequent issue, the June issue, by a fellow named Henry Goldsmith. We don't know much about him. The article, just like Rice's, is titled American Citrons. And he alleges, does Goldsmith, that no matter what you want to say, it's Morkov, they are grafted, they are puzzle for use on Sukkot. Leeser weighs in a bit. We now, because all of his letters, not all, his available letters have now been digitized by the University of Pennsylvania, a really important resource. And in the midst of all of this, actually directly after, Rabbi Moses Nathan, who was a rabbi in Jamaica and then in New Orleans, he testifies to Leeser. They're just fine. Trust me. It's not worth it's the economics don't bear it out. There's no way that they graft these things. They're spending all their time, are the farmers, on sugar. Say what you want. If they're the prettiest at Esrogim, they wouldn't do well in the Lakewood Shuk. That being said, they're perfectly fine for use, and Leeser supports it. It's this really interesting moment in which this halachic debate is happening. And to me, it is a debate about the worthwhileness of not just indigenous Esrogim, but indigenous religious culture. You see it with this. You see it with certain, with the kashrut of Muscovy duck, for example. There's much ado over that around this time in the pages of the Occident. It's Bernard Illway. We'll have to talk about that another time. But all these discussions about local resources is to me, an argument for whether or not America can become a major station of traditional Jewish life.
Yeah, and I think there's one more player here, right? There's Rabbi Schwartz. That's also when he gets involved as well, right?
And so this is so there is exactly right. There is another figure who arrives a little bit afterwards, Rabbi Yosef Schwartz in the Divrei Yosef. You can find the copy of it on HebrewBooks.org, in which he doesn't become a permanent residence. He lives in the United States from 1850 to 1851 in a formal tshuva. He's actually the one where Dr. Sarna and I were able to. I have to confess, I've never held a Caribbean Etrog before. Mine come from the local shul and school fundraisers. He tells us that there were people who still by 1850, 2 or 3 years later, after the whole episode between Rabbi Rice and Goldsmith, people are asking him about the suitability, the fitness of Caribbean Etrogim, and he said they're quite fine. Again, not the prettiest Etrogim, but for all practical purposes, he testifies, I made a bracha on Etrog in America.
Wow.
And again, the fact that they're writing about this in the language that they're using a halachic parlance, to me is trying to wed the two together, traditional Jewish thought and the viability of American Judaism.
Yeah, and I will mention that in the chapter, in the book, there are 2 pages from the accident reproduced, as all the pictures are in color.
A very pretty book. It's unlike the Caribbean Etrogim, say their accusers, this book is a really handsome volume. It's a real treat. Most authors, sometimes they don't even ask us if we would like illustrations. Very rarely have I been in a book where there are color images. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, and it's really nice. You can read it. One of the pages that you have there is in English. One is even in Hebrew. So it's from the accident. So it's really nice. Okay, so that settles this discussion of the Caribbean Esrogim. So another thing that you mentioned in the chapter, should be mentioned, is Esrogim during the Civil War.
Right, it's very hard to import them in time. Much money is lost at sea. Sometimes, what's an Etrog worth if it's 8 days too late? The answer is not much at all. So the liability of having, and this is really important, until the 1870s, Pam Nadell's dissertation, Professor Nadell's dissertation, and she put it into an article many years ago, is on the transformation of immigration and culture upon technological innovation. What do I mean? The movement of sail to steamship. It takes 3 weeks to travel from Europe to the United States before steam. With the advent of the steamboat, 6 days, which isn't just important for mobility's sake, but also there are obviously severe medical implications and disease, and also the economics of it. 3 weeks can be delayed. And if you can't get your Etrog in time, then all of a sudden those patrons are out of luck. And what it means is that in the Civil War and post-Civil War period, we find that there is a severe dip in the use of Etrogim in the United States. Now, that has much to do with the rise of Reform Judaism. Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, the architect of American Reform Judaism in many ways, suggests, okay, if you don't have an Etrog, use a lemon. You don't have a lemon, use an orange or an apple, he writes in an editorial. But what that speaks to is the lack of interest in Etrog observance. Remember, as religion starts to wane to some extent in the United States, Sukkot, the fact that it comes on the heels of the high holidays, people start to forget about it a little bit. And so what that triggers with the problem of importing Etrogim, what it triggers is a waning of interest in Etrog and Sukkot observance.
So, but does this waning lead to the rise of the California Esrogim? I don't know if there's such a rise, but does then that start to go up?
So those who are interested in it and want to make sure they procure Etrogim traveling to the West Coast. Remember, with the gold rush, all of a sudden there have been railroads that are established, and that is another option to do it. They also don't look exactly the same way that of their expectations. For example, Corfu Esrogim are much in vogue around this time. Probably talk about that in a moment. But with the advent of steam, truly those who are interested in it start to wheel and deal with European Etrogim. And all of a sudden, American Jews become interwoven into a much larger politic that involves no small figure at all, an inspector.
Yeah, so you mentioned Corfu. So first of all, I had a recent episode, listeners probably familiar with Michelle Margolis and Sharon Lieberman-Mintz, who's one of the editors of this book, about Corfu and their exhibit going on with JTS in Colombia about Corfu. So we discussed a little bit the story over there, but you can mention over here, and a inspector gets involved, the Corfu Esrogim and the American rabbinate, so to speak.
So you've already heard it. You've already heard about it from much smarter people than I. Corfu Esrogim that is the typical Etrog that we see in our mind's eye. They are very good-looking Etrog. And what happens is that towards the end of the 19th century, there is unfortunately a major blood libel accusation, and there is a pogrom in Corfu. There were already existing questions about, well, wait a second, if it looks so good, this is the problem with Etrogim. If it looks so good, maybe it's a lemon, which is problematic. So you don't want your Etrog to look too good, or else people will be suspect. There's already a back and forth in rabbinical journals in Europe in the 1870s and certainly by the 1880s about the fitness of Corfu Esrogim. But once there is a pogrom in Corfu, all of a sudden attention is paid to the yeshuv. And it becomes not just a halakhically more acceptable resource to import Etrogim from Eretz Yisrael, but in fact, it becomes a statement of one's fidelity to whether the Zionist mission or just the Jewish settlement in the Holy Land to start to use these Etrogim. And American Jews play a role as well in this. And it becomes American Jews at the end of the 19th century are, except for radical reformers, are deeply invested in the Zionist project. And to support economically and religiously Etrogim by purchasing Eretz Yisrael Etrogim or Petach Tikva, particularly Etrogim, become a huge boon and a statement about where one lies in the political religious spectrum.
So the chapter in the book kind of ends here. Obviously, there's more in there than we discussed. So it's a very nice chapter, very nice to read, very readable. But what happens in the 20th century? I know you don't really discuss that so much. Do you have, let's say, with the 20th century Esrogim, or it's just...
So what would a sequel look like? There are attempts for economic purposes to bring Etrogim from California and in Florida. That is absolutely true. I think there's one farmer left in Sacramento, as I recall. He wrote the New York Times about a decade ago, who tries to peddle Sacramento Etrogim. What would it look like? I'm really interested. If I sort of broaden this out, I introduced this term mitzvah merchants. I remember growing up in Baltimore, where my father would take me to somebody's house, a rabbi's house. He would make the bulk of his income from the 5 days in between Yom Kippur and Sukkot. You would walk down to his basement entrance, and you would pick out your Etrog, your lulav. You would pick out the posters, the Rishonim poster. You could purchase a whole sukkah from him. You could the fake fruit, the dried fruit, the whole thing. We've replaced that with online opportunities, with Amazon opportunities. To me, the 20th or the post-war story of the Etrog is the story of the rise and fall of the mitzvah merchant. How we've gone from shopping in somebody's basement to putting your credit card information online. How we've gone from talking about the Jewish street in places like Brooklyn, Chicago, Los Angeles. Los Angeles does peak up. But how we've gone from looking at stores and storefronts to now shopping at a distance online. And to me, something has been gained. There's more of a business, but maybe it's more affordable. But we've lost something in the intimacy of making Yantif and doing Shabbos. And to me, that would be the sequel to the story. I don't know how to write that yet. Throw in the history of the Candyman to that story, and you got something really thrilling. But to me, that's the next chapter.
Well, it's funny in Lakewood. There's still a lot of people selling Esrogim in their houses and all of all the sets, and you still have the shuk. Although as of last year, as of the time of this recording, I'm not sure, but as of last year, it went from the BMG shuk and went to Blue Claw Stadium parking lot. But you still have the Lakewood shuk. Maybe there's multiple locations. Famous shuk in Yerushalayim as well. I mean, there still are. Like I said, in Lakewood, people selling, but yeah, definitely changes. So just finally over here, I mean. Is there any other reading? If anyone's interested in more about America and Esrogim, is there anywhere else? I mean, there are, I think, some 50-something sources in your article, in your chapter here in the book.
For American Etrogim, so Jenna Joslett, I think, has a very important article, a chapter in this book as well, that speaks to this history from a different lens. But there's a wonderful bibliography about much of this. Another colleague, Dr. Sarna student is Adam Mendelson, who wrote a very important chapter a number of years ago on Torah trading and Chumash trading, of how did Sifrei Torah and how did Chumashim migrate from Europe to America, and what does that mean for these things? This has there's a wider lens to all of this. How did we access them? And again, I have to stress is there's something really interesting about when America became viable. After all, we don't talk about Minhag Philadelphia, Minhag Portland. We still talk about Minhag Ashkenaz, which creates a distance between the questions about the suitability of America for a traditional Jewish experience, but research into these types of things reminds us about the tensions about trying to do Jewish in the New World.
Yeah, okay. And as you mentioned, Jenna Joslett's chapter 15, right after yours, is Fruitfulness, American Jews and the Fate of the Etrog. So that is the next one. And yeah, thank you very much for joining me. And as I said earlier, I will link to this book that people can read your chapter.
Wonderful.